It's good to be with you. We do have time constraints on this session, and because it's a life of David Livingstone, I hope that it doesn't come across as a lecture, but I do have to read most of my notes, and I'll try not to make it too formal as a lecture. But I just want to read two verses of scripture that you can't forget when you're thinking of David Livingstone, and it's the very end of Matthew's Gospel in Matthew 28. Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things that I have commanded you. And lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Amen. Well, keep those verses in your mind as we think of David Livingstone. Most first-time visitors to the City of London include in their itinerary a visit not only to Buckingham Palace and the Houses of Parliament, but also to Westminster Abbey. That's the heart of the nation's capital. For well over 1,000 years, the Abbey has been the centre of the pomp and the pageantry of the nation, and it's where most of the kings and queens of England have been crowned. State funeral services usually take place in Westminster Abbey. A number of those kings and queens and national heroes are buried inside the Abbey itself. And in one corner, there's known as Poets' Corner, there are memorials to all the great men and women of literature and letters and classical learning. Stephen Hawking has just been, his remains have been buried there. But the casual visitor, you may walk up the centre aisle of Westminster Abbey in order to appreciate the sense of history, and you may be totally unaware that you are walking over a very simple grave of somebody who wasn't royal, not a great statesman, not a great warrior, or a famous poet. It's the grave of a man who was born in obscurity and in poverty, and his life and his labours drew the attention and the admiration of not only of the British people, but of people all around the world. And today, that man's name is hardly ever mentioned or known. But there is an inscription on the gravestone which 4 successive monarchs have walked across as they've gone to their coronation. If you ever watch maybe a royal wedding in Westminster Abbey, you'll see the bride coming down, and then they walk around and then further on, and they're walking around this gravestone. And on the gravestone it says this: brought by faithful hands over land and sea, here rests David Livingstone, missionary, traveller, philanthropist. For 30 years his life was spent in an unwearied effort to evangelize the native races, to explore the undiscovered secrets of Africa, to abolish the desolating slave trade of Central Africa, where with his last words he wrote this: all I can add in my solitude is, may heaven's rich blessing come down on everyone, American, English or Turk, who will help to heal this open sore of the world. Now, David Livingstone travelled 29,000 miles in Africa. He added to the known portions of the globe about 1 million square miles. He discovered many famous lakes, the Zambezi, other rivers, the first white man to see the Victoria Falls, probably the first individual to traverse the entire length of Lake Tanganyika. And had his health not failed, he would have succeeded in discovering the source of the Nile. He was made a member of he was made a British consul, a member of the Royal Geographical Society. He received gold medals from the Geographical Societies of Great Britain, the United States, and of France and of Italy. He was regarded as one of the greatest explorers and Christian missionaries that Africa has ever known, and perhaps the only missionary who has ever received a state funeral in Westminster Abbey. And until recently, his portrait was still printed on the £10 note of the Clydesdale Bank in Scotland. Now, what was the reason why he became such a well-known figure, and how did he engage in his immense task? Well, that's the aim of this paper this morning, and I don't know whether I'll get through it or not in the time. But he was born in a small cotton mill town named Blantyre, which is about 8 miles from Glasgow on the banks of the River Clyde in Scotland. His forebears were among the hardy people who'd come to the mainland of Scotland from a tiny remote island named the island of Staffa in the North Atlantic. And on arriving in the mainland, the Livingstone family settled in Blantyre. His father worked first of all as a tailor and then made a moderate living as a tea merchant. And his father was a devout Christian man with a warm, tender heart, deep, noble convictions, a great reader of good books, a committed member of the Congregational Church. Family worship, morning and evening, regular attendance at church, strict observance of the Sabbath, total abstinence were the characteristics of his life and his home. His wife, Agnes Hunter, he married her in 1810. She was a godly, gracious and tender woman who shared all the ideals of her husband, always active and orderly. She had a clean eye for cleanliness, something that she instilled into her children. And that had a deep impression on David Livingstone, who during his roughest times in Africa never slackened off in his habits of personal hygiene and his concern for his personal appearance. 5 sons and 2 daughters were born to the Livingstones, 2 sons dying in infancy. They lived in a little tenement building shared by 24 other families with 1 outside toilet, no inside running water. And if you go to Scotland, go to Glasgow, just go to Blantyre, the building is still there, preserved exactly as it was in David Livingstone's day. The family lived, they cooked, they ate, and they slept in 1 room, 14 foot by 10 foot. The black fireplace provided not only the warmth and in the grueling winters, but it was the fire for cooking and for boiling water. And David and his brothers lost count of the times that they had to walk down a tightly curved, winding brick staircase to bring water from the pump in the yard and heaving it back up the stairs to the 3rd floor and to their room. Now, from his childhood, he showed an unusual love for nature and through great perseverance, and perseverance was the thing that characterized his whole life. He gained a number of academic prizes and he excelled his playmates in many, many different ways. At the age of 10, he had to go and make his own living in the cotton mill and then spend his evenings in night school. So he was awakened at 5:30 in the morning, gulped down a plate of warm porridge, made his way to this large, grim building where he worked from 6 a.m. till 8 p.m. And his job, with many other young boys, was to look after and mend the threads of cotton which broke on the loom. So that required these boys to be very, very agile enough to climb over and under the machinery. And they reckoned that on any given day, these boys would traverse about 20 miles running up and down, often crawling in stooping positions. And the men who were working the machines were paid by the amount of cotton that they produced. So they kept these young boys on their toes and thrashed them if they didn't, or if they made any mistakes. Well, a steamy temperature required for spinning cotton, 80 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So throughout the whole of that day, these boys had half an hour break for breakfast and then 1 hour for lunch. And that went on 6 full days a week. And that was David Livingstone's environment for the next 10 years. And many of the children were so exhausted at the end of the day, they had no energy whatever in order to play or time to do anything else. And some of them, including David Livingstone, defied their own aching bodies and they made their way to the company's school. And they would work from 8 o'clock until 10 o'clock of a night. And then he would return home, and it was said that he would study and he would read. And his mother often had to go or stop him in the room from reading and go to sleep. During the daytime in the mill, he would often prop his books on the spinning jenny, and he would catch a glimpse as he's running back and forth so that he can keep on studying. And with the first part of his wages, he purchased a copy of Rudiments of Latin, and he studied the Latin language all his life. At the age of 12, he came under great conviction of spirit by the Spirit of God and was concerned about the state of his own soul. and he was helped by an elderly Christian lady whose wise instruction caused him to realize that religion and science were perfect friends to each other. And another old Christian spoke to him from his deathbed and said, "Now, lad, make religion the everyday business of your life, and not a thing of fits and starts. For if you do not, temptation and other things will get the better of you." And then he started reading the life of that other great missionary, Henry Martyn, and he made these statements which became the tenor and the tone of his life. "In the glow of the love that Christianity has inspired," this is Livingstone speaking, "I resolved to devote my life to the alleviation of human misery. It is my desire to show my attachment to the cause of him who died for me by devoting my life to his service." Well, he continued in the mill 6 days a week, saving up his money, studying Latin, studying botany. He had a good grasp of theology. His father, after some reluctance, finally agreed with his son that David wanted to become a doctor, and then he wanted to go and to preach the gospel. So at the age of 23, he set out with his father, walked the 8 miles to Glasgow to find accommodation where he could study Greek, theology at the university, medicine at Anderson's College of Medicine, and these were the days before chloroform. So a lot of the surgery was done without chloroform. Dr. John Brown, the son of the great biblical commentator, said that chloroform was one of the greatest gifts of God to mankind. And I used to say that to my dentist before she gave me this. You think of it, having to have those things without any chloroform. And surgical operations were hurried through without any anesthesia. No antiseptics had been discovered at that time. Nothing was known about the diseases that Livingstone would later encounter in Africa, such as malaria and blackwater fever. Now, despite all those inadequacies, David studied hard. He learned as much as he could about the use of surgical instruments, and at the same time keeping himself abreast of the latest developments in medicine and surgery. And he was going to use that knowledge later on in his years. He went on to apply to the London Missionary Society to become a missionary in China. And after some delay in responding on their part, he was accepted by them to do some further training in London. And so he goes to London, and in London he meets a remarkable man named Dr. Robert Moffat, who persuaded him to go to Africa. And Robert Moffat told him about a vast plain north of the mission station where he was working, where sometimes, and I quote, "by the light of the morning sun could be seen the smoke of 1,000 villages where no missionary had ever been." So that was the challenge to the young David Livingstone, and so he set his heart to go to South Africa. He could just spend one night with his family, went back to Blantyre. The family hardly slept that night. They talked about the prospects that lay before him. It was still dark when they knelt down at 5 o'clock that morning, November morning. David himself led the family to the throne of grace in prayer. He'd already decided which psalm he would read to the family, Psalm 121. And there they made their farewell, and he commended himself and his loved ones to the care of God. And then he walked the 8 miles into Glasgow to the part by the River Clyde, which is known as the Broomielaw, where all the ships would go off. Passed there many, many times myself. So with the words of Psalm 121 ringing in his ears, he set sail, first of all, across the Atlantic to Brazil, with an unexpected stop in Rio de Janeiro. Then the ship crossed the Atlantic again to Cape Town, and he stepped ashore beneath Table Mountain, and little did he realize how many problems and how much suffering would be his lot in the vast continent of Africa. And the interior of Africa was still a mystery to the outside world, despite the huge traffic in slaves. And the Arabs to the south of the Sahara had never ever ventured inland from the coast. They simply relied on the native tribes to bring gold and ivory and slaves from the interior. And transport was extremely difficult. There's thick tropical forests, rivers full of rapids. The deadly disease of malaria was widespread. And all of those difficulties had deterred the most enthusiastic explorers who looked at the state of these natives. They couldn't see anything in Africa that they couldn't get anywhere else apart from the African himself. So most of the south of Africa had been colonized by the Dutch and by the British, and there was a widespread disagreement concerning the emancipation of slaves and the abolition of the slave trade. And among the various missionaries he found working there was a good deal of tension and infighting and differences of opinion about the slave trade. And Livingstone expressed his concern and disgust with this kind of characteristic bluntness. And I quote, he says, "I see it of great importance that missionaries should be united and not spend time grinning at each other while the devil is leading sinners down the sides of the bottomless pit." Well, he would find that bluntness of his, especially in condemning the slave trade, would continue to make him unpopular. From Cape Town, he headed northward to the interior, where Moffat was working in the Bechuana territory. He purchased ox wagons, a supply, and set off on a 530-mile trek. And travel was slow and tortuous, 2 or 3 laborers leading the oxen from the front and driving them from behind. A number of years ago, my wife and I took the same journey along the same route, and for over an hour we had to travel by car over one of the most rough, unsurfaced roads we've ever been on. It was difficult to believe that these early settlers, including Livingstone, had driven ox carts over this same route. Well, he stopped at the same place that we did in a little town called Grafrinet, and he described it as the prettiest town of all Africa. And there he met 2 Christians who he said were worth going 200 miles to make the acquaintance of. And that was Andrew Murray and his wife, and some of you may have Andrew Murray's writings. And Andrew Murray had established the Dutch Reformed Church in that town. And then from there he went north until he reached his destination at Kuruman. And on the way, he says that he was incensed at the unkind treatment of the natives by various Europeans. So he's mingling among these people, healing their diseases, and very often disarming any kind of hostility. And his desire was that all the natives should have an opportunity to embrace Christianity. And his decided preference to labor where no man had ever worked before. So it led him to keep relocating again and again, moving northward into the interior, establishing mission stations wherever he went. Now, 2 qualities of life manifested themselves immediately, and they were characteristics which were going to demonstrate his future greatness. One was the ability to cope with the difficulties of travel, whether it was by ox wagon or horse or on foot. And the other characteristic was that he had a quick understanding and a deep sympathy for the native Africans. So from the moment he landed on African soil, he was haunted day and night by the visions and voices that beckoned him to these undiscovered regions. So a few months after his arrival, he made a long journey over 700 miles, winning the confidence of the natives wherever he went, using his medical abilities all the time, teaching, preaching, caring for the sick, building an occasional chapel as an outstation. And crowds of sick and suffering natives begged this great white doctor to heal them. And at night around the fire, he'd listen to their stories, he would tell them about Jesus. And the only problem with the area of the mission station was that it was infested with lions. And Livingstone decided that he was going to rid this valley of these lions. He heard that if one in a troop is killed, then the rest will leave the area. So he took with him a native worker, and then there happened one of the most famous incidents in the entire life of David Livingstone. He was attacked by a lion. It pounced on him by surprise. He managed to shoot at it, and then as he began to reload his gun, the wounded lion sprang up, shook him as a cat shakes a rat, and left his arm crushed to the bone. And the native helper grabbed his gun, and seeing the motion of the upraised gun, the lion turned away from Livingstone, sprang upon the native, biting him through the thigh, and then another worker, coming with a spear, was bitten just before the lion toppled over dead as a result of the bullet wound. Now, Livingstone's arm was stiff and useless from then on, and whenever he raised it, intense pain shot through his body. So his left arm had a substantial loss of power for the rest of his life. It was interesting that when his body was brought back from Africa to England, the only way they could define that it was Livingstone was by this arm. Well, he returned to Curraman to have his arm treated and to recuperate. Although he was unmarried when he left for Africa, upon his arrival he met the daughter of Robert Moffat, and an interest developed between them. In his eyes, Mary Moffat was looking prettier every day, and eventually they made plans to marry. As soon as his arm healed, he would hasten back to Mabotsa and build for her a little stone house. He was married in March 1844, with Robert Moffat performing the ceremony. And then came a 200-mile ox wagon honeymoon to the little home in Mabotsa, where they remained until 1845. Now, it was late in 1845 that he moved to another location, Kolobeng, where Sesheli, the chief of the tribes, became his first convert. And these moves were just the first steps of many that were to characterize his life. Each letter home ended with the words, "Who will penetrate the heart of Africa with the gospel?" And he was sick at heart when he heard of well-fed Christians at home engaged in hair-splitting discussions over doctrinal themes, when millions were dying without the gospel where he was. At last he began another tour, during which he crossed the Kalahari Desert. For days, no water. Overcoming insurmountable difficulties, he discovered Lake Ngami. The local chief welcomed him, but because of the unhealthy conditions, the situation didn't prove suitable for a mission station. He conceived the idea that if a way were opened from the interior of Africa to the coast, then Christianity, civilization, and commerce would move freely into the heart of Africa to these benighted people. But that undertaking involved fearful hardships and a great deal of self-denial. And it was at about that time that he wrote this: "I place no value on anything I have or possess, except in relation to the kingdom of Christ." Now, for the sake of his wife, and she had now borne him 3 children, he tried to settle down in an ordinary mission station. But for David Livingstone, it was impossible. The call of these distant lands constantly beckoned him. He said he could always see in the far horizon the smoke of 1,000 native settlements where no white man and no missionary had ever been. So he goes to some of those settlements, and on his arrival he sees the smoke of others still further away. And then he listens to the tales that the natives were telling him about the waterfalls and things like that. So he sees the 3 great rivers, the River Nile, the River Congo, and the Zambezi, emptying themselves into 3 separate oceans. And he convinces himself that the man who can solve the riddle of the sources of those rivers can open up the whole continent to commerce and to civilization, but most of all, to missionaries who would bring the Christian gospel. So he goes on and on over these slave tracks littered everywhere with bones, through forests, through marshes, the deserts where no man had ever been before. And he makes a score of discoveries, one of which would have established the fame for any man, but they wouldn't satisfy him. In 1856, 15 years after he landed in Africa, he's surrounded by hostile, infuriated savages. His life had never before seemed to be in such imminent danger. Death is staring him in the face. He's thinking of his life's work as being hardly begun. And for the first time in his experience, he's tempted to steal away under the cover of darkness and to seek safety. He prays to the Lord. So listen to what he says in his journal. January 14th, 1856, evening. felt much turmoil of spirit in prospect of having all my plans for the welfare of this great region and all this teeming population knocked on the head by savages tomorrow. All power is given unto me in heaven and on earth. Go ye therefore and teach all nations, and lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of the world. And then these famous words, it is the word of a gentleman of the most strict and sacred honour, so there's an end of it. I will not cross furtively tonight as I intended. Should such a man as I flee? No, I shall take observations for latitude and longitude tonight, though they may be the last. I feel quite calm now, thank God. Now those words, it is the word of a gentleman of the most strict and sacred honour, so there's an end of it. They were underlined in his journal, and they were underlined in Livingstone's heart and mind. He trusted the word of Christ with every fibre of his being. And so he's now determined to open up a way to the west, to the Atlantic coast. And about the middle of 1853, he reached Linyanti on the Zambezi. And here the chief gave him all the assistance that he needed. And they gave him 27 men and some oxen. And so he threw himself into the heart of Africa. And after 7 months of hardship, he reached the west coast. And during the journey, he had 31 attacks of intermittent fever. And towards the close of the journey, these were accompanied by dysentery of the most painful type. He suffered untold pain and discomfort. He had terrible hemorrhoids, having to stay in his tent and then being carried by these native helpers for days on end through forests and rivers, constantly destitute of food. And along the way, he witnessed the horrors of polygamy and of incest and of cannibalism. And it was the practice of some of the tribes that if any baby cut the teeth in the upper gum before cutting the ones in the lower gum, then the baby was put to death. And so he's witnessing all of this. He sees the cruelty of slavery as families were broken up by gangs and bodies were chained together, and they suffered the most terrible brutality. Bodies lying by the wayside, bodies flowing down the rivers. And the slaves were manacled in heavy chains, and the men had their necks placed in a fork of stout wood and 6 or 7 foot long. So there would be 2 men, and they would have their necks riveted at both ends, the boards riveted at both ends in these hard boards, and they would only be removed when they reached the coast and they boarded the ship. So Livingstone is seeing all of these slave parties, and on occasions he's challenging these slave traders, and occasionally he would get some of these slaves released. Well, this expedition arrived at Luanda on the west coast, and nobody expected to see Livingstone. There was no mail awaiting him. A boat offered him passage back to England, but he refused because he'd promised to this native chief that he would return with these helpers. He was desperately needing rest and recuperation. And when the news that he was alive reached England, there was astonishment and admiration, and the Royal Geographical Society awarded him its highest honour of a gold medal. So a journey of 2,000 miles was before him as he began his return trip from the west coast eastward. And he's meeting more hostile tribes on the way. He arrives at Linyanti on September the 11th, 1855. He went down the Zambezi River and he discovered the famous, beautiful Victoria Falls, the first white man to see them. On the May the 20th, 1856, he reached the east coast, and so he'd covered a territory that had never been seen by any white man. And then after 16 years of absence, he made his first visit to England, and he arrived in December 1856. And if he'd risen from the grave, he couldn't have been looked upon with more interest and loaded with more honours. He visits his native Scotland to the University of Glasgow. They conveyed on him the Doctor of Laws, And on such occasions, the recipient is usually subjected to some kind of banter at the hands of the students. But when Livingstone rises, bearing on his body the marks of his struggles and sufferings in Africa, he received this reverential silence. So he is a gaunt, haggard man as a result of his long exposure to the sun. And on nearly 30 occasions he'd been laid low by the fevers from the swamps, and that had left his mark. And so a hush falls on this great assembly, and he announces his resolve to return to the land for which already he has endured so much. And I quote, "But I return," he says, "without misgiving and with great gladness. For would you like me to tell you what supported me through all the years of exile among people whose language I could not understand and whose attitude toward me was always uncertain and often hostile? It was this: Lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the world." And it was on that pledge that he constantly hazarded everything that he had, and that pledge never failed him. Now, on that trip to England, a very serious matter had given cause for concern. The London Missionary Society, who had sent him out, felt that it wasn't right that he used a lot of his time exploring the country. And Livingstone had a strong conviction that the end of the exploration is the beginning of the exercise or the enterprise. So disappointed and disillusioned, he withdrew from the mission board and he engaged himself with the Royal Geographical Society, and he went back out as the Queen's consul to Africa on full government pay. Now, on the 10th of March, they arrived with their son, or they left with their son from England, and Mary Moffat, his wife, had never been strong as a woman, and she'd struggled through years of dusty deserts, jungles, not seeing another woman, another white woman, just the native women around her. And with these little children tugging at her skirts, David Livingstone knew that she couldn't struggle for much longer. So he had previously taken his wife and children to Cape Town, and amid many tears, he saw them set sail for England. They went back to England. And she stayed at home and she prayed for her husband, who pressed on. And when she eventually returned to Cape Town, Mrs. Livingstone became so ill that she had to remain behind, and she couldn't go north and join him for several years. But even in Africa, the gossips will talk, and the gossips went to work. And the gossip was that he and his wife had a difficult marriage. There was something wrong with the marriage. Even an Anglican bishop wrote a pamphlet that spoke about the Livingstones' failed marriage. And so David Livingstone wrote to his wife, and he said, "You must join me to scotch all of these rumours." And she made this tremendous journey up the central part of Africa to join him, to avoid all this gossip. And it's very, very moving. I'm trying to keep my notes and look at the time, but if you read his journal, and she eventually arrives there, and she's very, very ill, and he's got a couple of tea chests, and he gets these tea chests, and he puts a mattress on them, and that's where she is lying, and he's nursing her, and he's in his journal, "Oh Mary," he says, "I loved you when I married you, and the longer I lived with you, I loved you the more." And he's holding her hand until she died, and he buried her beneath a baobab tree. And in his journal he says, "For the first time in my life, I feel willing to die. I'm left alone in the world by the one whom I felt to be a part of myself." And then he says, "Lo, I am with you always." And relying on the word of a gentleman of the strict and sacred honour, he set himself again to set out to evangelize the native races, to explore the undiscovered regions and to abolish the slave trade. Now I'm looking at the time. He engages in evangelism, exploration, and emancipation. So I'm going to miss out quite a bit of material on that. You're probably aware of the fact that the outside world were mystified as to where he was. They'd never heard of him for such a long time. And they thought, well, maybe he's dead somewhere and nobody knows. And at that moment of mystery, a man named James Gordon Bennett of the New York Herald sent Henry Stanley to locate the explorer. And he said, you must find him at any cost. And Stanley's effort was a marvelous adventure in itself. And Stanley wrote this: no living man shall stop me. Only death can prevent me. But death, not even this. I shall not die. I will not die. I cannot die. Something tells me that I shall find him. And I write it larger. I'll find him. I'll find him. Well, it took Stanley over 2 years to find Livingstone. And it was a wonderful day for Livingstone when they met. And Stanley brought with him a typical kind of American. He brought loads of people, loads of provisions. He even brought a bath with him. And they spent 4 months together exploring Lake Tanganyika. And Stanley became a hero worshipper of Livingstone. And Stanley wrote this: I challenge any man to find a fault in his character. The secret is that his religion is a constant, earnest, and sincere practice. And once in his early life, Livingstone had said, anywhere, provided it is forward. And so even into his old age, instead of returning with Stanley, he made a new resolve that he's going to press on into the interior. In March 1872, he's 59 years old, he wrote, my birthday, Jesus, my King, my life, my all, I again dedicate my whole life to thee. And so he's going forward through these rivers and swamps, dysentery, excruciating pain, these terrible hemorrhoids. At one point, he was confined to his tent for 4 months because of these bleeding hemorrhoids. And he said he read through his Bible 4 times in those 4 months. It's amazing. Well, his love for the Africans was such that he was willing to endure all of those things in order to win them for Christ. And at every convenient place, he asked his carriers to stop and let him rest. And on April the 29th, it was the last day of his travels. He'd reached the village of Chitambo in Ilala on Lake Bangweolo. Well, the Africans will forgive me for pronunciations, but he was sick unto death. He made his observations, latitudes, longitudes, brought his journal up to date, drew his maps, and he gave his orders. He rested quietly on the 30th, but at 4 o'clock in the morning of May the 1st, 1873, the boy who slept at his door wakened up, and fearing that his master had died, he called for a man named Susie, who was Livingstone's personal friend, the native helper. And by the candle still burning, they saw him, not in his bed, but kneeling at the bedside, his head buried in his hands on the pillow. And the sad but not unexpected truth became evident. He died. No white man near him, no woman to nurse him, no friend to strengthen his faith by reading him the scriptures. He died alone, yet not alone. Lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. It is the word of a gentleman with the most strict and sacred honour, and so there's an end of it. Now that word of honour had not been violated, but he died in the act of prayer, in that reverent attitude about which he was always so particular, commending his own spirit with his dear ones to the Saviour. His last entry in his journal says this: he will keep his word, the gracious one full of grace and truth. No doubt of it, he will keep his word, and it will be all right. Doubt here is inadmissible, surely. Well, those pictures of him on his knees is the best testimony that the promise of Christ was kept. Now, I haven't the time, and words couldn't do justice to what happened after that. These faithful servants, led by Susie, they removed the heart from his body and they buried it under a tree near where he died, and they dried the body in the sun, and they decided to take it to the coast where it could be shipped back to England. And so they tied it to a pole, and they set out on a 1,000-mile trek through the forests, the swamps, the rivers, sickness plaguing them. 10 men died. Others were at death's door. And after a 9-month march, they reached the coast. And the body was placed on a ship, and it was brought to England. On April the 18th, 1874, the remains were laid to rest with the greatest honours in Westminster Abbey. And the news of Livingstone's death quickened the pulse beat of the world and roused many thousands to think about the Christian gospel. Now, in recent years, it's become popular to debunk any kind of hero or heroism. And that's true of David Livingstone. Many people criticised him and said that he was a failed missionary. He was just an explorer because he couldn't say that there were many converts. Well, they failed to realise that he was a man of the highest standards. And David Livingstone would never say that somebody had been truly converted unless he had seen after several years that they were showing the fruits of righteousness. So he wouldn't say you've been converted until after a couple of years he saw the evidence that they were. And so his legacy after his death is that the whole continent of Africa was opened up to the spread of the gospel. And in many places in Africa, he's still regarded with the highest esteem. Countless streets, buildings in Zambia bearing his name. In Malawi, the capital is Blantyre, named after his birthplace. He struggled, he sowed in tears, he never gave up. And through the providence of God, that seed eventually germinated, and millions have come to faith in the continent of Africa, which as a result of the work of this one man is no longer called the Dark Continent. I'm right on time. Well, I just pray that it might inspire you to read more of the life of David Livingstone and be thankful for people like that who've brought the gospel to us.